Well, it's that time again. Toyotathon is back with the best deals this side of the West. Toyotathon's my favorite thon, right above Thon Legacy and the Thon song. This joke sucks.
It's the end of the decade again. Since 2010, I've graduated high school, went through 6 years of college, and got my first full-time job. It's been an incredibly transformative 10 years for me, but you don't care about me, you care about games. But similar to my decade, gaming has gone through a major transformation as well. One console generation ended with the PS3 and Xbox 360, and another began with the PS4 and the Xbone, because Microsoft really X-boned that one. Nintendo also did a thing with the Wii U, and after a lot of back and forth, it's hard to tell if people actually liked it or not. We'll figure that out, but they did a much better thing with the Switch. In fact, we're only 1 year away from a new console generation starting up again. But toward the beginning of the decade, I was pretty burnt out on games. For a while, it seemed like most AAA games were pretty much blending together for me, following a pretty standard structure of go to Radio Tower, unlock checklist, do all of it, and move on to the next Radio Tower, Ubisoft. And don't get me wrong, there were absolutely outliers in that aspect, especially toward the end of the decade when games got weird and different again. But at the same time, gaming through the 2010s will be defined in my eyes by the shift to narrative over gameplay. Stories became way more important this decade. They became so much more important than the actual gaminess of the games we were playing. Games like The Last of Us were fantastic linear narratives driven by a dynamic between Joel and Ellie, where you had Joel trying to be the father he couldn't be to save Ellie and protect her from the outside world. But the problem was, gameplay got in the way of story for me. My favorite parts of The Last of Us were when Joel and Ellie were walking around and looking at like record stores, and Ellie was like, "What is this?" And Joel had to explain to her that before the end of the world, essentially, people listen to music for fun, and there was just this amazing dynamic between two characters where one of them saw a world before, and the end of the world is basically all of Ellie knows. The gameplay segments really slowed it down for me, and it wasn't until years after it came out that I actually finished it in anticipation for The Last of Us 2. For a while, I wasn't even sure if gaming was for me anymore. I'll never forget talking to one of my coworkers at Game Store about how uninterested I was in everything coming out, and he told me, in 10 years, you won't be gaming. And that really has always stuck with me. But around a decade after that conversation, I can honestly say I'm playing more games now than ever. There's so much more out there for anyone who wants to give gaming a chance, and they will probably find something that they will love. Like, there's so much out there right now. For me, the games of the decade have widely been defined by the indie developers making the games that they wanted to make, over big budget games that just want to make a quick buck. And from the thousands of indie games, so many great games have emerged. So for the end of the decade, I want to go through each year and pick out a few games, AAA and indie, that really stuck out to me as games that defined my decade, that led up to this year and last year. The first couple of years in a long time, I've really fallen back in love with gaming. Be warned, this is not a definitive list of the best games of the decade. Leave that to the professionals. This list is just me celebrating the weird and the wild and the experimental of this decade. Here's a small disclaimer, this is my list, you no doubt have your list, and if I missed something that absolutely changed your life, I didn't do it intentionally. Don't take it personally. It's not to spite you or the developers. Chances are I just didn't get a chance to play it. If you have suggestions on games I should play though, absolutely start a conversation with me down in the comments or on Twitter with me at under 10 hours. But be nice about it. If you're not nice about it, I'm gonna have to tell my mom. If she finds out, she'll call your parents and you can't sleep over Friday night. For the sake of keeping this interesting, I added a few rules to myself, just so I could keep kind of a focus. There's no sequels or re-releases in this list. Sorry, Little Big Planet 2, I love you, but be gone. Also, I'm going to be talking about games the year they released, not the year I played them, so that way it keeps a little bit more of a focus. So if I did it the other way, it would just be like a year would come and go, and then I'll be talking about a game like 3 years after it came out, because it came to a system I had or something. So, for instance, games like Don't Starve that I didn't play until this year, I'll refer to it the year it came out. I know it's a pretty different game now, but I played the base game without all the DLC, and so I think it still stands up correctly. But without any further ado, let's get started. So 2010 was the year that I started to get burnt out. Probably because in terms of the new department, games were kind of lacking, and obviously there were outliers. You had critical hits like Super Mario Galaxy 2, Fallout New Vegas, but there were a lot of sequels in established series. So this year was a bit dull for me, but I do have a few standouts. Minecraft. What else can be said about Minecraft that hasn't been said already? Nothing. Danganronpa Trigger Happy Havoc. Now, technically this game came out in 2010 because it was released as a PSP game in Japan, but once I played it on Vita, my roommate and I were hooked. This was like a full semester of our college experience. Danganronpa is essentially a visual novel / investigation game where you, the luckiest student in the world, literally, gets selected to attend this amazing school. But the twist is every student is the best at something. Best student, most athletic, most popular. You're the luckiest. But then the tables turn when the adorably terrifying master Monokuma, a literal teddy bear, informs the students the only way to get out of the school is to get away with murder, meaning the students have to turn on each other to get a chance at freedom. Once a murder happens, there's a trial where everyone is on jury at once, essentially, and everybody has to try to collectively figure out who murdered the student. Now, if the murderer gets away with it, the murderer walks free, leaving everyone else to perish a dark fate of Monokuma's making. And it gets really dark. It is really, hard to watch at some point. It is cartoony, so it's not, horribly gruesome, but, the ways Monokuma murders people is insane. If you have a PS Vita, if you have a PS4, you've got to play this series. It's fantastic. I just can't recommend it enough. Blur. 2 words, transit van. Blur was the last game that really shook up the formula of arcade racing games, in my opinion. Sure, games like Forza Horizon has licensed vehicles, but when was the last time these licensed vehicles threw projectiles at each other and destroyed each other? As someone who didn't have a Nintendo console at the time, this was the PS3 equivalent of Mario Kart for me, because when none of my friends bought a Wii U, we needed a replacement for Mario Kart, and Blur fit that perfectly because of the varied tracks, the crazy pickups, the licensed vehicles, and just the all-around chaos of the game. This game did not get enough recognition in my eyes, and it's ridiculously cheap now because of it, so if you want some kind of crazy racing game that you can just throw in every now and then, Blur is the perfect candidate for that. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. I gotta be honest, I didn't read the Scott Pilgrim books until way later than I should have, but even when the movie came out, I picked up Scott Pilgrim vs. the World as a download on PS3, and I don't even like beat-em-up games in general, but this game had me hooked. The humor, the art style, and the gameplay were top-notch, and the local co-op let me finish the game with a friend. It was just the icing on the cake. It is a crime and a travesty that this game is no longer available to play via official ways, basically. Let me play this on Switch, just re-release it. Alpha Protocol. Alright, let me get this out of the way. Alpha Protocol is by no means a great game, and by all accounts, it's probably not even really a good game either, but where the gameplay lacked in most every department, Alpha Protocol had a fun dialogue system that let you drastically affect the story and let you choose how the protagonist kind of ended up by the end. It felt like a choose-your-own-adventure that was completely let down by mediocre gameplay. But just the idea of the choose-your-own-adventure and the dialogue options and the way you could really affect the world was really cool to me. It's probably not worth playing. It just... another game with this kind of style with better gameplay needs to be made. Super Meat Boy. If you haven't played this game, why are you even watching this? Go play it now, it's good. So 2011 was a little bit better for me. While I was still pretty uninterested in a lot of games from this year, just fun games like Saints Row the Third are still highlights for me. But this list doesn't allow sequels, so let's talk about something new. Rage. Rage was pretty underrated in my eyes, but for good reason. It came out at a time when Borderlands was already kind of dominating the outer space shooter niche. Rage still did a lot of things right in retrospect. Mainly the boomerang knife thing is what I remember most because it was so fun. It was cool as hell, but what really held it back was the uninspired art direction, as most of the colors just looked like they were selected from a naked eyeshadow palette. Yes, that was a makeup joke, if you're keeping score. Binding of Isaac. The Binding of Isaac is one of those games that when you're in the mood to play it, no other roguelike will do. And trust me, I've tried to replace it, it just isn't happening. When the game first came out, I couldn't get into it really because I don't like the mouse and keyboard. I understand it's a superior way to play or whatever, but I can't actually stand using them. So when the Switch came out, I was taken with this game. I absolutely adore it. There is so much to do, discover, and try out. It's truly a game you could probably play forever, and I'm horrible at it. I've only ever beaten the mom one time, and I am alright with that. It's just too fun to put down. So here's where the list gets a little bit weird. Sure, we've heard of Telltale for the amazing Walking Dead series, Wolf Among Us series, but Hector: Badge of Carnage is a game that I wasn't expecting to really like because it was before I knew who Telltale was and what they were doing. And I played this game on my iPhone when I was just in high school, and essentially it's a point-and-click adventure game where you take the role of Hector, a detective who hates everything, including his job and life. I didn't play many mobile games that had kind of a bigger scope than just being puzzles, but since it's a point-and-click adventure, it fits right at home on a touchscreen. And while you can't actually get them on the iPhone anymore, you still can get them on Steam, and I'm honestly tempted to do so. So if you like point-and-click adventures with a ton of British humor, and like the idea of playing as a character who just is begrudgingly doing literally everything, I highly recommend checking out Hector: Badge of Carnage. 2012 was a year where tons of home console games were ported to mobile for some reason, and there were so many sequels worth talking about. But looking back, indie games really stole the show for me. Darlings like Spelunky made its way to consoles, FTL, Faster Than Light, Plague Inc., they were all released this year. The independent uprising began, and not a moment too soon. I honestly still play a lot of these to this day, even years after release. And I'm still absolutely terrible at all of them, so it just shows you how good they are that I can continue being punished and keep coming back. Fez. Fez deserves being a standout in this list, not only because it's one of the best games I've ever played, but it's also a major source of sadness for me. See, the creator of the game, Phil Fish, as you probably know, has sworn off traditional games entirely. After announcing a sequel to Fez, he unplugged from games seemingly for good and crushed any chance of a sequel. But what's worse is, I'm afraid, because there's no driving force behind it, it's gonna get lost to time because there's no one pushing the game forward to new systems. And for as much as I love this game, the thought of never being able to play as the lovable Gomez ever again truly breaks my heart. But why is the game so excellent? It's a great puzzle platformer with tons of replayability, beautiful art, beautiful music, and just an incredible premise. One day, this little white thing, Gomez, wakes up and is betrothed a magical Fez from the gods, giving his 2D perspective a three-dimensional take on the world around him. Once you get the Fez, using the left and right triggers rotates the world counterclockwise or clockwise, allowing you to solve puzzles in different, mind-bending ways. Since the game starts out in just 2D before you get the Fez, it really kind of messes with you at first, but it's so cool and rewarding because it makes you just think differently about every puzzle. And then if you want to complete the game, there's a new game plus mode that gives you the ability to go into first-person mode to look for clues and secrets to complete the game 100%. I absolutely adore this game, and I wish it would just get brought to Switch or some other kind of new console, because I don't want to lose it. Retro City Rampage. Retro City Rampage is not a game for everyone. It's the kind of game designed to be as packed with references as possible to pop culture and the 80s. The game started as a Grand Theft Auto demake for the NES called Grand Theft Tendo, and eventually it became its own thing on modern consoles. It was developed entirely by a single person, Brian Provinciano. If you aren't a fan of the 80s or aren't a diehard fan of pop culture and references, you might not be into it, but just being able to run around and Koopa stomp pedestrians is enough that I still play this game to kill some time sometimes. A lot of love went into it, and the world itself feels alive. It's a perfect place to run around and cause mayhem. While I totally understand not everyone will love this game, the bad reviews this game got surprised the crap out of me. By no means is this game broken or bad, it's just a very specific kind of game that knows exactly what it is and only does just that. To me, it's incredibly underrated, especially after being made for years by a single person. Even if it was made by a team, I was still impressed by it. If you're into a lot of references or a top-down Grand Theft Auto style game, you might want to check it out. It's pretty cheap, but just keep it in the back of your mind. Hotline Miami. Whew, I cannot get enough Hotline Miami. The Twitch gameplay of running into rooms trying to kill enemies while they try to kill you as a bumping synthesizer soundtrack plays behind you is such a good time. I sunk hours of Hotline in between classes into my Vita because going back to other missions to unlock the different masks was so much fun. I cannot recommend Hotline Miami enough. It's just a great game and the sequel is fantastic too. 2013. In 2013, Grand Theft Auto 5 was hands down my game of the year, but there's still plenty of other games that came out. In addition, we got our first taste of the next generation consoles by the end of it. Again, I can't talk about Grand Theft Auto 5, but what I can talk about is Don't Starve. Don't Starve is a tough-as-nails survival roguelike, which means yes, I am bad at it, and yes, I cannot stop playing it. It's been described as Minecraft with a Tim Burton aesthetic, and while I can't really argue with that, but minimizing it just to a Minecraft clone doesn't really do the game justice. It's way more than that. Not only are you trying to survive by finding food and building shelter and fighting off enemies, you also have to keep your mind in a safe place. You gotta keep your sanity, or else the shadows will become lethal and actually kill you. And that means starting over from day one. It is brutal, but it is hard to put down at the same time. Every death usually teaches you something about the game, but you might want to bring a guide anyway, because I got to day 26, and out of fear of not losing, I just kind of stopped and called it a win. Deadpool. I'm not even ashamed to say that the release of Deadpool overshadowed the release of The Last of Us, as they released 10 days apart for me. While the gameplay was a hard 6 out of 10, possibly lower, the humor and just the insanity that comes with Deadpool knowing he's the main character of a video game makes the game worth playing. And if you like the sound of that, I'd recommend giving it a try. Resogun. Resogun was a launch title for the PS4 that I honestly totally forgot about until I was making this list, but I sunk hours into it. It's a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up that uses these amazing voxel graphics that essentially explode when you destroy enemies, and they just turn into blocks after you hit them. It's a great little game that slipped through the cracks for a lot of people, despite being very well received by critics. I really liked just watching things happen on screen because the dark backgrounds with neon light voxel art was just really pleasing to the eye. 2014. 2014 was our first calendar year with the Xbox One and PS4, and I was hoping that some heavy-hitting games would really get me back into the swing on the gaming bandwagon. And while games like Infamous Second Son more or less filled that wish, I fell more in love with my Vita than ever. This was the year I played Hotline Miami for the first time, along with Binding of Isaac. 2014 was the year my Vita earned its stripes as a staple in my book bag to take to class. Luftrausers. Luftrausers was one of those games that had me glued to the handheld. It's a Devolver Digital game about building a variety of jet fighters out of 3 different segments: the body, the gun, and the engine. Each segment of the plane gives you different objectives to level them up or get new parts. Luftrausers has hours of content, a ton of replayability, and it's just fun to kill some time with. Shovel Knight. Shovel Knight is another game that has received more praise than most indie games, and for fantastic reason. Shovel Knight is just an excellent homage to retro games with the hilarious hook of playing as a knight who only uses a shovel as a weapon. I absolutely adore this game. As soon as I finished playing it, I played it again without checkpoints. There's just so many ways to play this game and add challenges to yourself to get more and more out of it. And the fact that the game, the Treasure Trove version, is $25, and over time it just grew and grew and grew, and now you have basically 5 fully fledged games on one package. It's amazing, but the original Shovel Knight is what got it started, and I honestly think Shovel Knight might be one of the best games I've ever played, and it's definitely one of my games of the decade. Threes. I'm not a mobile gamer, like I said, but I will always have a special place in my heart for Threes, a riff on the game 2048 with simple graphics and adorable little number characters that you unlock as you grow the numbers. It's a great little puzzle game, and if you have a device that lets you play it, definitely check it out. I've sunk hours into this just waiting around for different things. Can't stop playing it. The Escapist. I didn't really play The Escapist until last year, but once I did, I got the hype. Boosted by my love of Orange is the New Black, I was intrigued at the idea of a game that let me take the prison politics of the show, throw it entirely out the window, and let me hit anyone I wanted with a sock full of soap whenever I wanted. In The Escapist, you have one goal in mind: escape jail at any cost and do it in any way you want. That means biding your time and waiting for the right opportunity by getting in with the guards, or you can just save up a dozen plastic spoons and dig your way out of the jail in the dead of night. It's really up to you, and that's what makes it awesome. 2015. I gotta be honest, 2015 was probably my least favorite year of the decade. There was a lot that came out, it was just underwhelming sequel after underwhelming sequel. Fallout 4 was underwhelming, Saints Row 4 was too off the rails for its own good. I just kind of scrolled and what games came out, and only a couple of games really stood out to me this year. Mad Max. 2015 was the best possible year Mad Max could have come out in my eyes due to the lack of noteworthy games. And still, this game is more or less a footnote of the year. When I think of criminally underrated games of the decade, the first one that comes to mind is Mad Max. This game did vehicular combat right by allowing you to collect cars and modify them to suit different challenges. It was a game where it took the world it was set in seriously, meaning gas and ammo were hard to come by. You had to ration both to be successful. Heavier armored car layouts drank gas by the gallon, while lighter cars were faster and took less gas, but you could destroy them in an instant. Not to mention the fact that the on-foot combat was a pretty solid ripoff of the Arkham game combat, but that style of combat wasn't as played out then as it is today, where basically every game has a version of it. So, going back, it might not have aged well simply because so many games ripped off the Arkham Knight combat. 2016. 2016 was the worst year of my life, but let's talk about the stuff that came out when I was dodging depression, shall we? This was the year I really got into modding Game Boys, from Game Boy Color to GBA. I really had fun taking them apart, making them work again, building a few systems that I really love and cherish. This partially became the seed that eventually became this channel because I was deep into the weeds of retro games. In fact, I finished Pokemon Gold for the first time this year in spite of starting it and stopping it countless times. But what actually came out this year? Pokemon Go. Speaking of doing the Pokemon thing, Pokemon Go was not only one of the most important games of that year, but probably one of the most important games from that time in my life, if not the most important. I literally couldn't play Pokemon Go at home, meaning, despite the deep depression I was in, I had to get out of the house and hang out with friends. The long drives at obscene hours of the night trying to catch a Weedle are some of the fondest memories I had of that year because it helped me keep my sanity, even if just for a short while. Sure, the game had and still has its flaws, but that game got so many people playing something together in the world around them. It was kind of amazing. Now, I don't want to go off on too big of a tangent, but just to tell you how big Pokemon Go was, I was working at a large store as a cart attendant when the game came out in 2016, and when I tell you every employee was playing it instead of doing work for a good 2 or 3 months, I'm not lying. One of my favorite stories came from when I was trying to get carts with one of the other cart attendants in the parking garage that was next door to the building. And we're just hanging around, doing nothing, trying to catch some Pokemon. And all of a sudden, one of the security guards in his security golf cart rolls up and he's just like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And we were like, we're working. And he said, "You playing Pokemon?" And we were like, "Yeah, we're playing Pokemon." And he was just like, "There's a Scyther in the north lot." And at the same moment he says that, he gets an urgent radio signal that says Pikachu in Pikachu in the south lot. So we ran in 2 different directions to try to go get our Scyther and Pikachu. It's just that is the perfect story about how everyone was playing it and doing absolutely no work. So I gotta be honest, I wasn't playing many games in 2016. There wasn't much I cared about that came out. I dabbled in Stardew Valley, but it was almost too relaxed for me. Like, I just want to make $1 billion selling pumpkins, and that takes work. I want to play The Witcher 3 soon, but yeah, 2016 was just kind of a dud for me. I might go back and try to get a little bit more out of it in the future, but 2016 just ain't it. 2017. 2017. The year my gaming got its groove back, thanks in no small part to the Nintendo Switch. But thanks to the rules I put myself in, I'm not allowed to talk about the life-changing experience that Breath of the Wild turned out to be, or how refreshing Mario felt in Mario Odyssey. Nope, none of that. But what I can talk about is Hollow Knight. Hollow Knight changed my entire perspective on Metroidvania games as a whole. Hollow Knight is one of the best games I've ever played, period. The tight combat and navigation of the world is almost rhythmic, letting you sink into a groove of gameplay that I've rarely experienced before. The game can be tough as nails at some points, but finally conquering an enemy you've spent a few minutes on and just failed over and over again is so satisfying. It feels like a triumph, an aha moment that makes you feel like you really did something. Where it succeeds is letting you know that you are the reason you fail. You are not good enough to succeed. You are the reason Grimm is kicking your ass 37 times in a row before you can beat him. Never was I actually mad at the game, I never felt cheated when I died. And that's really important to me because I feel like some games are hard for the sake of being hard where they just hate you, but this game is so much more than just gameplay. It's the art, it's the atmosphere. It's peeling back layers of the world showing how decrepit the world of Hallownest is. I spent hours upon hours getting all the endings, soaking up everything there was to do in the game. I was heartbroken when it ended. Not because of the true ending, but because I had little else to do. I cannot wait to dig into Silksong, the game sequel, when it hopefully releases next year. Cuphead. Thank God I own a Switch, or else I would have never been able to experience Cuphead and the never-ending frustration that comes with it. You know what it is, you know why people like the art style and the gameplay, but honestly, I was shocked at how many people think this game is a platformer rather than a run-and-gun game kind of like Contra. It's not a good or bad thing, I just think if you dive in under that misconception, you might be hit with some whiplash. Sure, there are a couple of platforming segments, but overall, this is a boss rush kind of game where you're just taking down wild and crazy enemies made of food, balloons, even the devil himself. It's a ton of fun to play alone or with friends, but be warned, this is not a walk in the park. This game is tough. Golf Story. Golf Story is what happens when you accidentally drop your copy of Earthbound into a blender with Tiger Woods' PGA Tour. Golf Story shouldn't really work, but it does. What drew me into the game was the Mario Golf arcade style, because there's nothing I hate more than actual golf. You play as an amateur golfer trying to make it big on the professional circuit, and most of the time you end up causing chaos by accident. It's a fun little game if you want to play some Mario Golf on a new system, and there's no actual Mario Golf to play. One of my biggest complaints was that the game did not have multiplayer on launch, but it was added later, and for that, we thank you. 2018. Moving into 2018, we saw the second year of the Switch, and in that year, I played less and less of my PS4 and more Switch. It was just so much more convenient to play on the go, especially since I'm really not one to nitpick graphical quality dips for games like Doom, Wolfenstein, all of the ports basically. Playing Doom outside of class on a handheld is worth some mediocre texture sometimes, it just is. But there was still a ton of new stuff that didn't have to worry about graphical issues. Games like Celeste. From the maker of Towerfall, the amazing co-op competitive bow and arrow game comes Celeste, an incredibly well-designed platformer. You play as Madeline, a girl whose only goal is navigating to the top of Celeste Mountain. Along the way, you come to terms with your inner demons as you begin to realize that this feat is far more than just a climb up a mountain. The story's incredibly sweet, but it's only there if you want it to be. Strip it away, and you still have a top-notch, challenging as can be platformer with hours and hours of post-game content. It's a game that I bought day one and still go back to every couple of months to go chisel away at those B-sides and C-sides. Yoku's Island Express. Ask me what two genres of games go together like oil and vinegar, and I'd probably say somewhere near the top of that list is pinball and Metroidvania. But when you do shove oil and vinegar together, you get a pretty refreshing salad dressing, or so I'm told. I hate salad. But that smushed together concoction of genres gave us Yoku's Island Express, a Metroidvania-style game that relies heavily on pinball bumpers to navigate the world. Again, it's a game that shouldn't work, but it does on such a deep level that I honestly can't believe it hasn't been done earlier. The closest thing I can think of is Mile High Pinball on N-Gage, which, coincidentally, was my last favorite pinball game up to this point. Wreckfest. If you've been around the channel, you probably saw that I made a video about Wreckfest already. I praise it for a variety of things, but the feel of the cars and the crash physics really set this game apart from anything else this gen. To see my full review, which is essentially me screaming into the mic about my adoration for the game, you can just check it out in the link below. And here we are, 2019, the final year of the decade. Honestly, due to finishing my final year of college and starting this YouTube channel, I really didn't have time to play many new releases, so I'm afraid this year might end on a bit of a dud. The year started strong with Resident Evil 2 Remake, which I absolutely adored, followed by Mario Maker 2, Luigi's Mansion 3, and Pokemon Sword and Shield, easily the two biggest controversial games of this year, if you don't count Death Stranding. I started and finished more games than I have in years, but I honestly struggled to find a game with a new IP that really took me. That said, Outer Worlds is high on my list of games to play, but mentioning it wouldn't be right since I've never even touched a copy. Shakedown Hawaii was another game that I was really looking forward to. It's another game from V-Blank, the same guy who made Retro City Rampage, and as someone who really liked that game, I was incredibly psyched to play it, but it was way too similar to RCR, or maybe its entire point of the gameplay to get money to buy property, which let you get more money to buy more property, was just a cycle that I didn't really enjoy. It felt after a while you had more money than you knew what to do with, and there was really little point in continuing. Put it down a while ago, but part of me feels guilty for not finishing it. But I just didn't enjoy it the way I thought I would. But toward the end of the year, we had games like Untitled Goose Game, another game I waited forever for, but this time the wait was worth it. Untitled Goose Game exploded on the scene when it was finally released. You probably know about it already thanks to the meme status it achieved, but just know that I laughed basically the entire time I played it. It's a great little unplug and unwind kind of game that's just pleasant for a few hours. Sayonara Wild Hearts. Sayonara Wild Hearts caught my eye the first time I saw an indie direct a while ago. It was at the top of my girlfriend's list of games to get when it came out, but there was barely a word out on it until it finally dropped kinda by surprise in September. It's worth the wait for the gameplay, the art style, the music, and the story. I kind of find the game a little bit hard to describe, so go with me for a second. Imagine if Outrun, with its point A to point B levels where you dodge enemies, collect stars, find collectibles all on foot, motorcycles, skateboards, or in a car. It's a really cool game that has a ton of replayability. It might not be for everyone, but I think it's worth every second that you play it. It's just great. So now, if you've made it this far, which you probably haven't, I'm going to give away some awards for the end of the decade. I'm getting rid of the rules so that essentially sequels can be involved, because there were a few games I wanted to talk about that just didn't fit into the rules of this list. But without any further ado, here are some awards for the end of the year. The best game I didn't mention because they were sequels or reboots. This one is a tie between Saints Row the Third and Driver San Francisco. Saints Row the Third was the perfect kind of follow-up to Saints Row 2. The story wasn't very good, but it was just enough to bring the main characters to a new city, and just, it's one of the most fun open world games ever because it doesn't take itself seriously. Like, you can just, there's a car that you can run people over with that turns them into ammo for a cannon and shoot them at other people. It's hilarious. Driver San Francisco is also one of the most underrated games of the decade. It is fantastic. The driving is amazing. The story sets it up in a way that makes it make sense that you can phase out into any car you want and take over people's bodies without it being super weird. The game takes place in a coma, so essentially all of the game happens in your head as you solve a crime, basically, on the verge of death. It's amazing. It's fantastic if you like racing games. It has amazing little Easter eggs, like driving 88 miles per hour in the DeLorean in the game unlocks the first level from the first Driver game, which is impossibly hard. So it's just filled with a great little bunch of details like that, and I highly recommend it. My biggest disappointment of the decade was probably Shakedown Hawaii. After waiting so many years for the game, it didn't live up to the hype because I think it tried to do too much and then didn't give you a reason to spend all the money that you ended up getting, so it lost me. It lost me. That's all I can really say about it. My game of the decade has to be Hollow Knight. That game has become an essential part of my life. I love Hollow Knight. I didn't expect it to take me the way that it did. because like I said, I didn't really play many Metroidvania games, and there's just something so amazing about the entire package that so many people have said it more eloquently, but it's the world, it's the gameplay. If you haven't played it, at least give it a chance. It's very cheap. It's on sale a lot. My girlfriend got it for under $10, and I think it's just a game that's worth playing, and it's something you should experience at least once. My biggest surprise of the decade was Breath of the Wild. I didn't really play Zelda games before this. I really don't like the 3D Zelda games. I really like Majora's Mask, but the other ones I just either haven't played or can't really stand. And so when I got Breath of the Wild on launch day, I didn't even play it the first day I had my Switch. It wasn't until the next day, and when I just first started playing that game, it was a revelation in what open world exploration could be. You've probably heard countless people talk about it, but that game surprised me in so many ways. I put 100 hours into it. The bigger surprise was that my girlfriend, who didn't even have a Switch at the time, ended up putting 200 hours into it. It was a fantastic experience. I know it has its flaws. It doesn't have many it doesn't have many enemy designs, but it's just one of those games that really sets the standard, and I can't wait to see how they build on it for the next game. My biggest regret of the decade. Now go with me here. I didn't play WWE 2K20. I didn't buy any of the 2K games before that. But when I was a kid and had a PSP, my favorite game to take on the go was all of the SmackDown vs. Raw games, because they were fantastic. So when I heard that WWE 2K19 was coming to Switch, I got it day one. And I played myself by not holding out for a physical copy I could trade in. No. I bought the digital copy, which means I have a 60 gigabyte dumpster fire on my Switch. I've deleted it, obviously, but for the sake of the joke, it's still on my Switch. That game is a disaster. It is embarrassing. I feel like they deserve to give me my money back, but I can't do that. So that game, as big of a disaster as it was, is my regret of the decade. I don't regret buying games, but I regretted this one. So that's pretty much gonna do it. The end of the decade is here, and I can't wait to see where gaming goes in the next decade. It's been a crazy ride. I'm so happy that I'm finally back into gaming again. And I just want to thank you for letting me do this and make this channel and talk about games that probably no one's ever heard of. I've really enjoyed all of the discourse that started because of this, even the negativity on some of the videos. It's been overwhelmingly positive, but there was one video in particular that people really don't like my take on, and that's okay. But this decade has been a mixed bag of everything, but it's been overall pretty good, and so here's to looking to the next decade. If you somehow survived watching this video, give me a like on it. I worked really hard on it. It took me forever. So, if you don't mind, if you really like my opinions and have played some of these games, let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you haven't played them, tell me why. Tell me why you're not interested in some of these. That's fine. I'd love to know why. And I guess last but not least, if you somehow stuck through this and want to see more of what I do, you can always press subscribe or follow me on Twitter or something at under 10 hours. I'd really appreciate it. But until 2020, I will see you next time.